Let's look at the question. A class of 40 students took a mathematics test. The results are presented in the circle graph below. How many students earned a C grade? Based off our information, we're going to turn this into a multiplication problem. We're trying to figure out what is, since we're looking at C grade, our graph tells us 45% of students got a C grade. So we need to figure out what is 45% of 40 students. So I need to figure out what is 45% of 40 students. Given my setup, I'll change 45 to a decimal. It becomes 0.45. Of translates to multiplication, and 40 is 40. So this is really a question asking what is 0.45 times 40, and that will give us 18. So we say specifically 18 students of the 40 got a C grade. Let's look at the question. A class of 40 students took a mathematics test. The results are presented in the circle graph below. How many students earned an A or a B on the test? To determine this, we need to know what percentage are we dealing with. According to our graph, students who earned an A were 15%. Students who earned a B were 30%. So if we're talking about A or B, it means one or both. So that means we're going to add the percentages up to find the total percentage of students who got A's or B's. So we're essentially asking, in this case, 15 plus 30 becomes 45%. 45% of 40 students is what? Is what we need to figure out. So first, our two percentages were 15 and 30%, representing A and B students respectively. I need to find the total amount, so I'll add them to get 45%, which represents students who get an A or a B. So we need to think in terms of the question. 45% of our 40 students is what? I'll change my 45% into a decimal. It becomes 0.45. Of becomes multiplication. And 40 is 40. When I multiply, I'll get 18, or more specifically, 18 students in this class received an A or a B. Let's look at the question where a class of 40 students took a mathematics test. The results printed below. What percent of the students failed the test, and how many failed the test? So we have two questions. Looking at the graph, we can determine what percent of the students failed the test. We use A, B, and C as passing grades, which means F is our failing grade for 10%. So 10% of the students failed the test. To determine how many failed the test, we'll take our percentage and multiply it times 40. We're essentially asking what is 10% of 40 students? So again, I'm essentially saying what is 10% of 40 students? Since we're looking at 10% of students failing. So I change 10% into a decimal, 0.1 or 0.10. Of is translated as multiplication. 40 is 40. When I multiply 0.10 times 40, I'll end up with 4. So in this case, 4 students failed the test. Let's look at the question where a class of 40 students took a mathematics test. The results given in the graph. How many more students earned a C than earned a B grade? So if we're going to determine this, we need to figure out individually how many students earned a C and earned a B. Using our graph, we see that 45% of the students got a C on the test. So we need to change that into a numbers. And we see that 30% got a B. In the same way, we need to change that into a number that we can process. So for C grade, we said that was 45% of the students, and a B grade was 30%. Now keep in mind they're asking for how many students, not what percentage. If they'd asked what percentage is more, you could say 15% because 30 plus 15 is 45. When they're asking specifically for the number of students, we want an actual number, not a percentage. So when I change 45 into a number, a concrete number, I'm essentially saying 45% of my total population is what? So as a decimal, I need to change that percentage into a decimal before I multiply. Translates to multiplication. I'm saying what is 45% of 40, meaning what is 0.45 times 40. That's going to be 18. Doing the same thing for my B grades, 30% of 40 translates to 0.3 or 0.30, either one, times 40 students. And when I do that, I end up with 12. So a C translates to 18 students, a B translates to 12 students. The question being, how many more students earn C grades versus B grades? And that would be 18 minus 12 for 6, or specifically 6 students. Let's look at the question where a class of 40 students took a mathematics test. The results presented in the graph. What percent of the entire class passed the test? So I'm considering the entire class, and I'm considering what is the passing grade. In this course, we consider A, B, and C's as passing grades. F, of course, is not. So we should add up all the percentages that consist of a passing grade, and then we'll find out of 40 students, what percentage does that, what amount of students does that percentage equate to. So looking at my A, B, and C regions, I have 15, 30, and 45%, which when you add up, we'll get 90%. So we're considering that 90% of the students who took the test passed it. Again, from 30 plus 15 plus 45. Now I'm saying what is 90% of my total, which is 40 students. As a decimal, 90% becomes 0.9 or 0.90. Translates to multiplication, and 40 is 40. Now multiply 0.9 times 40 to find the total number, and that will be 36, or more specifically, 36 students passed the test. Let's look at the question where student research to attend the community college of Baltimore County is broken down in the following chart. What percent of the cost provided is for tuition? So we see again our graph is the cost per term at CCBC. And we want to figure out what percentage, what amount of that circle it is dedicated to tuition. First of all, we need to find what the total amount of everything is. What is the total cost for this term at CCBC? Which means we'll add $1,650 for tuition to $120 for fees to $400 for books. And in a question like this, that's what we always want to do, is find the total amount considered. And in this case, that's going to be $2,170 or $2,170. So total tuition $2,170. Or I say total costs. It's probably a better way of phrasing this. Where tuition is going to be $1,650. We're essentially asking tuition is what percentage of total costs. Let's put in what we know. Tuition is $1,650. Is translates to equals. The phrase what or what number or which number translates to our variable. We'll call that x. Of translates to multiplication. Total cost is our total cost. 2,170. So to solve for x, we need to isolate it, which means we need to get rid of the 2,170. And the simplest way is to divide each side by the number. Which means, and I'm going to reverse the sides here, x is equal to that fraction as a decimal, which comes out to be 0.76036. Next, I need to convert this to a percentage. Currently it's in decimal form. So to change it to a percentage, I multiply this value by 100. Now, as a general rule, I'm going to round my percentages to the nearest tenth of a percent. So I use my rounding. After moving my decimal point 2 spaces to the left, to the right, that would put my new decimal point at between the 6 and the 0. Using rounding, should I round 0 up to 1 or keep it at 0? Looking at the previous term, is a 3, it's less than 5, so I keep it as 76.0 or 76%. Let's look at the question where student research total cost for one term at the Community College of Baltimore County given by the following chart. If the student has financial aid that covers 45% of their total cost for the semester, how much does the student need to pay? If I'm going to determine that, I first need to know what's the total cost of a term at CCVC. So when I add up my tuition, books, and fees, it comes out to a total of $2,170. So there are my total costs. Now I know my financial aid as a percentage is 45%. I need to know what's the actual money value of that 45%. So my financial aid, we're saying, is 45% of 2,170. Financial aid being the dollar amount that we actually want. We know that it's going to be equivalent to 45% of 2,170. So looking at my expression here, financial aid, which is what I'm looking for, I'm going to put it as an X for now, translates to equals. 45% as a decimal is 0.45. Of translates to multiplication. And 2,170 is itself. So this translates to doing the expression, what is 0.45 times 2,170? That comes out to be $976.50. Now I'm not done. That tells me how much financial aid is covering, which means what's left over is for the student to cover. So the student is going to pay whatever's left after you take away the $976.50 from the original value. And when you do the subtraction, you're left with the student paying a total of $1,193.50. And since it's money, we want to round to 2 decimal places always. Let's look at the question where there were 44,283 crimes in Baltimore in 2010, as given by the graph. What category accounts for the most amount of crimes? What percentage does it represent? Round to the nearest tenth of a percent. I'll need to figure out the total number of crimes in the area. In this case, it's been given to me, so I don't have to add them all up. 44,283. Now I need to know what percentage of that is related to the largest crime area in this graph. And just visually, we see that's larceny and theft. So we're looking at larceny and theft is what percentage of 44,283. So in our total, 44,283, and my larceny totaled out to 16,298. Larceny being the largest category. Again, it's asking what percentage does this equate to? We're essentially asking the question, larceny, and I'll abbreviate with an L, is what percentage of the total crimes in this case. So putting in my numbers, larceny is 16,298, is translates to equal. The phrase what number, what value, what percentage refers to our variable, and I'll call it x in this case. Of translates to multiplication. Total, we said, is 44,283. So I'm solving the equation 16,298 equals x times 44,283. So to solve for my variable, I want to isolate my variable by getting rid of the 44,000. Since it's multiplication, to do so, in this case, I can divide, which should be the simplest, each side by 44,283. Now this graph, this question, wants a percentage. So right now all we have is a fraction. So I'll first divide this fraction out and get the decimal equivalent. And that comes out to be x is equal to 0.36804. Now I need to round this to the nearest 10th position. First, let's change it into a percentage, which means moving my decimal point 2 spaces to the right, becoming now 36.804. Since 8 is in the 10th spot, I'll look to the number to its right, and it's not 5 or greater, so it's just going to stay the way it is, and we'll say 36.8%. Let's look at the question for our scenario where there are 44,283 crimes in Baltimore in 2010, broken down into categories as seen. What percentage of the crimes are burglaries? Round to the nearest 10th of a percent. I need the total amount of crimes committed, which is 44,283. And next I need to know how many of those were burglaries. When looking at my chart, burglary was accounted for 7,573 of the crimes given in Baltimore. So I need to break this down. I'm going to say my total amount is 44,283, and burglaries, which we're considering, came to a total of 7,573. And again, the question is, burglaries are what percentage of total crimes? So I'll set it up as my equation. Burglaries, I'll abbreviate, is what percentage of the total amount of crimes. So let's put in the numbers. Burglary is 7,573. Is translates to equals. Phrase what anything, what number, what percentage, what decimal, etc. is something of universal slang for the variable. So in this case, I'll make my variable x. Of translates to multiplication. My total was 44,283. From this equation that I set up, I need to solve for x, which means I'll divide each side by 44,283. Once I divide this and get the value that I need as a decimal, I'll need to change it into a percentage by multiplying by 100. So dividing this out, I get x is equivalent to 0.17101. Run to the near, first I need to change to a percentage, which means I multiply this by 100. The effect is my decimal point moves 2 spaces to the right. So my new value is 17.1. 1 would be my 10th spot. Now if I look to its immediate right, the value 0 is of course not equal to or greater than 5. So I'll leave the 10th position as a 1 and 17.1%.